Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to take a brief call on the Identity Information Confirmation Bill. Mr. Speaker, most of the arguments have been made, so I shall repeat just a few of them, but the important ones. We've had one good comment about fielding Mr. Power. I think you may get a second one if the member may. Ashurst was where I lived, so I do know the place well. Identity fraud occurs, Mr. Speaker, when a person's privacy is breached, and that's the most important aspect of it. And somebody else pretends to be another person, and and takes that on that persona in order to access resources of some kind, generally credit, monies, etc., for personal gain, and in the name of that particular person. It's not a victimless crime. There are often victims, but often we don't fully understand what the effects of the crime are on the victims as well. If somebody simply has to pay for somebody else's theft of one's identity, then that is one thing. But the emotional effect of having one's identity stolen, that scar can last on the person whose identity has been taken for a long time. So it is, therefore, a serious issue. And of course, the organisations are also victims. Businesses can be victims also when they suffer financial and reputational losses in the same way as well. So the issue really has been brought into quite sharp relief for this particular House, and indeed, as others have said, when a member of this House in the previous life had stolen somebody else's identity, and how relatively easy it was for that person to do that. The person has paid a heavy price for that particular action and thoughtlessness, but the effect of the illegal action on the children, on the family of the child whose identity was stolen, has also come to light in this period as well. Likewise, New Zealanders were shocked when a couple of Mossad agents stole identities of children and took out passports, travelled to New Zealand and used New Zealand passports for their illegal activities, and used those passports for those illegal activities as well. So there are those kinds of cases as well. And of course the well-known case of Wayne Thomas Patterson, where he used over 123 different identities to commit fraud of $3.4 million. Now, these cases all tell us, Mr. Speaker, that indeed there is a problem and it needs addressing. And this bill sets out one way of trying to address those particular problems. Whether it addresses all of them is something we're not certain about, whether it addresses all of the problems. But certainly, because we know there is a problem and because it has serious consequences, then it is important to support the government to send this bill to Select Committee, where it can actually have the detailed examination by a whole bunch of other people who have experienced, either as victims or indeed from a privacy perspective, dealt with the cases. And for those reasons, we will support it to Select Committee. There is another aspect of that does concern me. There's certainly studies overseas do talk about identity fraud and what's the extent of identity fraud that's taking place. Some studies show that it's about 2%. Some other figures we see in New Zealand seem to suggest that some companies are saying it's much larger than that, although when they report about their own experiences of it, it's much smaller. So the extent of identity fraud at the moment we're unclear about, except, as we said, the types of cases that have come out have shown us that it's a problem that's important to address. The other point is that it's not easy to identify identity fraud. I mean, there are so many different ways that people can do it. And the attempt in this particular bill is simply to match somebody applying for some service, I would imagine, to match the information given to that service against reliable data that's in the state's databases is a useful way to start. Whether that's enough, we're uncertain about. But it's important. This will test our own privacy laws, and the privacy laws in New Zealand are particularly good, and they have held us in good stead over a long period of time, and there is a very good privacy Commissioner's Office that actually monitors this quite well and has been instrumental in taking New Zealand to quite a sophisticated level of data matching that goes on at the moment that keeps quite a good lid on the situation. So, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of good things about this bill. The most important one is that it is consent-based. And I think that's a powerful aspect of this particular bill, seeing as it's opening a facility to the private sector, and so people will need to consent. But as my colleague Ashraf Chowdhury said, that in itself raises a problem, which the Select Committee ought to examine in some detail. How is that consent to be given, and how is that consent to be, the person acquiring that consent needs to know that it has been understood what the person is giving, particularly when it comes to those people who are unfamiliar with the English language and filling forms and systems like that. So I think great care will need to be taken to ensure that that consent is available. And the other good thing is that we are using databases that we currently have. And it does address, as the commentary on the bill says, there are some compliance cost issues at the moment to do with another bill that's around money laundering, etc. So it addresses that bill. Those are, and perhaps the other powerful aspect of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is that it does involve the Privacy Commissioner. And in the regulatory impact statement, that was the major mechanism by which some guarantees could be given. So there's a lot of work for the Select Committee to do on this particular aspect as well. The risk, there are, however, some risks as well. The amount of information that could be available to the private sector, and how is that information to be utilized? I mean, imagine the case of a person here on a work permit and has applies for a job, and there is some need to get the data right. An employer is aware that permit only has a short period to run, may be in a position to abuse the kind of information that could be available. And I think that raises questions, and would be very, very interested to see how are those guarantees to be given, and the report back from the Select Committee. So the Select Committee will have to look at safeguards. And I say to my good friend from the Green Party, Keith Locke, it is precisely for these reasons that we're happy for this to go to the Select Committee, so that those kinds of guarantees that we require are at least can be addressed. And it goes further if we can be satisfied that those conditions that we require have been met. But the points that the Green Party raises are very good ones as well. And we've seen, when we try to address one problem, then it does have unintended consequences. It's entirely possible that will create some newer ones, which in time will cause us greater difficulties. So for those reasons, Mr. Speaker, it's useful for us to send it to the Select Committee. The final point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is that a member's surprised. This will not be a cure-all for identity fraud. It can't be. I mean, it's an issue that's probably much wider, much more complex. But the kind of this approach to it can't be the full solution. So I hope that we don't take these provisions as a cure-all, and the Select Committee might have other ideas that it might want to propose to the House for us to look at. So Mr. Speaker, we're pleased to support it for the Select Committee, but those are some very serious concerns that this side of the House has, and we shall look forward to those matters being addressed in the report back. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Cool. Nikki